Eddie Vasquez had been driving night shifts in downtown Chicago for 6 years. But when he noticed the same passengers using coded pickup locations and cash-only payments, his instinct from 15 years hunting organized crime kicked in, and the quiet cab driver realized his taxi had become part of a trafficking network. I wonder where you're watching this story from today. Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet suburb, you've probably seen them. Taxi drivers navigating through traffic at all hours, picking up strangers, witnessing the city's nocturnal rhythms. But how often do we consider what expertise these professional drivers might possess beyond their knowledge of streets and shortcuts? Today's story will change how you see the people behind the wheel during the darkest hours of the night. Eddie Vasquez had been driving cab 47 through Chicago's downtown district for 6 years. At 59, he had the steady nerves and street wisdom that made him perfect for night shift work in one of the city's most challenging areas. He knew every alley, every shortcut, and every corner where trouble might be waiting. Regular late-night customers appreciated Eddie's reliability and discretion. He picked up hospital workers finishing overnight shifts, restaurant employees heading home after closing, and business travelers catching early morning flights. Eddie maintained professional boundaries, kept his cab clean and safe, and had built a reputation as someone who could be trusted during vulnerable late-night hours. Fellow drivers respected Eddie's calm demeanor and practical approach to difficult situations. He handled intoxicated passengers with patience, navigated dangerous neighborhoods without incident, and maintained the kind of steady professionalism that made him a preferred driver for the city's more demanding routes. To passengers and colleagues, Eddie appeared to be exactly what he seemed, an experienced taxi driver who understood the rhythms of urban nightlife and could safely transport people through the city's darker hours. But Eddie's observational skills and street awareness went far beyond what was required for taxi driving. Before Eddie became a taxi driver, he had spent 15 years as Special Agent Eddie Vasquez with the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. He had infiltrated criminal organizations, conducted long-term surveillance operations, and dismantled trafficking networks that operated across state lines and international borders. Agent Vasquez had specialized in human trafficking cases, understanding how criminal organizations recruited, transported, and exploited victims using legitimate businesses as cover for their operations. He knew the signs, the methods, and the behavioral patterns that traffickers use to move people while avoiding law enforcement detection. Eddie's expertise had focused on the transportation aspects of trafficking operations. He understood how criminals use taxis, buses, trucks, and other vehicles to move victims, how they coordinated pickup and delivery locations, and how they use coded communications to maintain operational security. But 15 years of investigating the worst crimes against vulnerable people had taken a devastating psychological toll. Eddie had seen too many victims, processed too much human suffering, and carried too many cases where interventions came too late to prevent tragedy. When he reached early retirement eligibility, Eddie had chosen to leave federal law enforcement entirely. He wanted work that would provide income and structure without the constant exposure to human cruelty that had defined his FBI career. Taxi driving offered what seemed like the perfect escape, honest work that utilized his knowledge of the city while providing emotional distance from criminal investigations. For 6 years, Eddie had successfully maintained this separation between his past and present lives. He drove his routes, served his customers, and avoided thinking about criminal patterns or suspicious activities. But some training never disappears, and some instincts never stop working. It began 2 months ago with observations that Eddie initially tried to dismiss. Certain late-night passengers were exhibiting behaviors and using language that triggered his dormant investigative instincts, behaviors that suggested coordination, coercion, and purposes beyond legitimate transportation needs. The first pattern involved pickup and destination locations. Eddie noticed that specific passengers consistently requested rides to addresses that turned out to be empty lots, closed businesses, or locations where no one was waiting to receive them. These were classic techniques for obscuring actual destinations while maintaining transportation records that appeared legitimate. The second pattern involved payment methods and passenger behavior. These individuals always paid in cash, avoided providing names for dispatch records, and exhibited the nervous energy and hyper-awareness that Eddie associated with people involved in illegal activities, either as perpetrators or victims. The third pattern was the most troubling: coded communications and control behaviors that Eddie recognized from his trafficking investigations. Passengers would use phrases that sounded innocent but followed structured protocols, make brief phone calls using specific terminology, and exhibit relationship dynamics that suggested coercion rather than voluntary association. Eddie's 15 years of FBI experience told him he was witnessing a human trafficking operation that was using taxi services as part of their transportation network. Eddie's most disturbing realization came when he began recognizing patterns that indicated the presence of trafficking victims among his passengers. Young women and men who appeared frightened, disoriented, or under the influence of drugs. Passengers who seemed unfamiliar with Chicago geography despite claiming to be locals. Individuals whose personal belongings, clothing, and general appearance suggested they were being controlled by others. Most concerning were the control dynamics Eddie observed between passengers who traveled together. One person would answer all questions, control all interactions with Eddie, and exhibit the authoritative behavior that traffickers use to maintain dominance over their victims. Eddie recognized these patterns because he had investigated dozens of similar cases during his FBI career. These were textbook indicators of human trafficking: the systematic control, transportation, and exploitation of vulnerable individuals for criminal profit. But Eddie also realized that his position as a taxi driver provided him with unique access to trafficking operations that were normally invisible to law enforcement. Criminals felt safe using taxi services because drivers were expected to focus on transportation rather than passenger activities. Eddie faced a complex moral dilemma that tested his desire for peaceful retirement against his professional obligation to protect victims of serious crimes. Despite his reluctance to become involved in criminal investigations, Eddie found himself automatically cataloging his observations with the systematic approach he had once used for federal cases. His trained mind documented faces, noted timing patterns, and identified operational methods, even as he consciously tried to focus solely on driving. Eddie began maintaining detailed records of suspicious rides, including passenger descriptions, pickup and destination locations, timing patterns, and behavioral observations. His documentation followed FBI evidence standards because his training had made such precision automatic. Most importantly, Eddie started recognizing the operational structure of what appeared to be a sophisticated trafficking network. He identified what seemed to be supervisors, transporters, and handlers working in coordinated teams that used multiple taxi companies to move victims throughout the city. The network's discipline and sophistication suggested significant resources, extensive planning, and connections to larger criminal organizations that operated beyond Chicago's city limits. The trafficking operation escalated in ways that confirmed Eddie's worst suspicions about its scope and danger. Instead of isolated transportation requests, Eddie observed coordinated movements of multiple victims, systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals, and integration with other criminal activities throughout the region. Eddie witnessed passengers being moved to locations associated with forced labor, sexual exploitation, and other forms of human trafficking. His professional experience allowed him to recognize the signs and understand the implications in ways that civilian drivers could not. Most troubling was the increasing involvement of very young victims, teenagers and possibly preteens who were clearly being controlled, transported, and prepared for exploitation by criminal organizations. Eddie's parental instincts and professional training combined to create an urgent sense that intervention was necessary before more lives were destroyed by the trafficking network he was inadvertently serving. On a Thursday night in November, Eddie received a dispatch call that would force him to choose between his personal safety and his moral obligations. The pickup location was a motel known for criminal activity, and the passenger request came with specific instructions about avoiding main streets and police patrol areas. When Eddie arrived, He found a young woman who appeared to be in her late teens, accompanied by an older man who exhibited classic trafficker control behaviors. The woman showed signs of drug influence, physical abuse, and severe psychological distress. Eddie's FBI experience immediately identified this as an active trafficking situation where a victim was being transported for exploitation. The woman's condition suggested she was in immediate danger of serious harm or death. Eddie realized he was facing the same choice that had defined his federal career, whether to intervene when intervention carried personal risk or to remain passive while vulnerable people suffered. Eddie made a split-second decision based on 15 years of experience protecting trafficking victims. Instead of driving to the requested destination, he began taking a route that would provide opportunities for intervention while maintaining the appearance of normal transportation. Eddie activated his taxi's emergency beacon, a direct line to police dispatch, while engaging the passengers in casual conversation designed to gather intelligence and assess the immediate threat level. First time visiting Chicago, Eddie asked, studying the man's responses and the woman's reactions in his rearview mirror. The man's answers followed scripted patterns that Eddie recognized from trafficking operations, while the woman's behavior indicated she was under severe duress and possibly drugged. Eddie began varying his route to past police stations, hospital emergency rooms, and other locations where help might be available if the situation escalated dangerously. When Eddie realized the requested destination was a location associated with forced prostitution, he made the tactical decision to directly intervene rather than deliver a victim to further exploitation. Eddie pulled over at a well-lit gas station near a police substation, claiming mechanical problems with his taxi. As the trafficker became agitated and demanded immediate continuation of the trip, Eddie sent a coded emergency message to police dispatch using protocols he remembered from his federal training. "I need immediate assistance at the Shell station on Madison Street," Eddie transmitted. "Possible human trafficking situation in progress. Request female officer and medical response." The trafficker attempted to leave the taxi with his victim, but Eddie had positioned the vehicle to block easy exit while maintaining his own safety. His years of tactical training guided his actions as he protected the victim while avoiding direct confrontation that might escalate to violence. Chicago police responded to Eddie's call with the coordinated efficiency of officers trained in trafficking intervention protocols. Detective Maria Santos arrived with backup units, medical personnel, and specialists trained in victim services. The driver reports possible human trafficking. Detective Santos observed as she approached the taxi. "What's your assessment of the situation?" Eddie provided a brief but comprehensive briefing that impressed the responding officers with its precision and professional quality. The male passenger exhibits control behaviors consistent with trafficking operations. The female appears drugged and shows signs of physical abuse. Their destination matches a location associated with forced prostitution. Detective Santos checked Eddie's background and discovered his FBI service record. "Agent Vasquez, your organized crime cases are legendary. What brought you to taxi driving?" Eddie explained his transition from federal law enforcement to civilian work while maintaining focus on the immediate situation requiring intervention. Eddie's intervention led to the arrest of Marcus Johnson, a trafficker with connections to criminal organizations across multiple states. The young woman, identified as 17-year-old Sarah Chun, had been kidnapped from Seattle and transported to Chicago for exploitation. Eddie's professional analysis of the trafficking operation provided investigators with detailed intelligence about transportation methods, communication protocols, and operational patterns that helped identify additional victims and suspects. The investigation revealed that taxi services throughout Chicago had been systematically infiltrated by trafficking organizations seeking to use legitimate transportation as cover for moving victims and conducting illegal operations. Eddie agreed to serve as a consultant during the investigation, providing expertise about trafficking transportation methods while maintaining his taxi driving duties as cover for continued intelligence gathering. The investigation expanded far beyond the single incident Eddie had interrupted. His intelligence led to the identification of a trafficking network that operated across the Midwest, using taxi services, rideshare platforms, and other transportation methods to move victims while avoiding law enforcement detection. Federal agencies joined the investigation as evidence revealed connections to international trafficking organizations and operations spanning multiple states. Eddie's expertise proved valuable not only for the Chicago case, but for understanding how trafficking networks exploited transportation systems nationwide. The multi-agency operation resulted in 73 arrests, the rescue of 45 trafficking victims, and the disruption of criminal operations across 6 states. Eddie received commendations from the FBI, Chicago Police Department, and anti-trafficking organizations for his role in dismantling the criminal network. But he valued most the letter he received from Sarah Chun after her recovery and return to her family. "You saved my life when I had given up hope that anyone would notice I needed help," Sarah wrote. "Thank you for seeing me when I had become invisible to everyone else." The case became a training example for law enforcement agencies nationwide, demonstrating how transportation professionals with investigative backgrounds could serve as valuable intelligence assets for trafficking investigations. Eddie's success led to the creation of the Transportation Anti-Trafficking Partnership, a program that trained taxi drivers, rideshare operators, and other transportation professionals to recognize signs of human trafficking and report suspicious activities to law enforcement. Eddie continued driving his taxi while serving as a consultant for trafficking investigations and training other drivers in victim identification and reporting protocols. His dual role allowed him to use his expertise while maintaining the civilian employment that provided psychological distance from the trauma of criminal investigation. The program expanded to include former law enforcement officers, military personnel, and social service professionals whose backgrounds provided valuable capabilities for identifying and assisting trafficking victims. Eddie's work led to significant changes in how transportation services approach human trafficking prevention. Training programs were developed to help drivers recognize signs of trafficking, understand reporting procedures, and safely assist victims without putting themselves at risk. The Chicago Transportation Authority implemented protocols that allowed drivers to confidentially report suspicious activities and receive support during trafficking-related incidents. Similar programs were adopted by rideshare companies and taxi services across the country. Most importantly, Eddie's intervention demonstrated that trafficking victims could be identified and rescued through the observational capabilities of experienced professionals working in civilian transportation roles. 7 years after the Sarah Chun rescue, Eddie Vasquez continues driving night shifts while serving as a trafficking consultant and victim advocate. His work has expanded to include training programs, policy development, and direct assistance to trafficking survivors. Eddie has helped identify and rescue dozens of trafficking victims, prevented countless additional crimes, and created systematic approaches that protect vulnerable individuals who use transportation services. His experience demonstrates that expertise in criminal investigation can be successfully integrated with civilian employment while serving the greater good of community protection and victim assistance. Eddie's success inspired other retired law enforcement officers to seek employment in positions that allowed them to continue using their investigative skills to protect vulnerable populations. The Transportation Anti-Trafficking Partnership has documented hundreds of cases where former FBI agents, police officers, and military personnel have identified trafficking operations through their civilian employment in transportation, hospitality, and service industries. These individuals create an invisible network of experienced observers who can recognize trafficking situations and provide immediate assistance to victims who might otherwise remain invisible to official law enforcement. Eddie found that his role as trafficking consultant provided the satisfaction of protecting victims without the institutional stress and bureaucratic challenges of federal law enforcement work. He could use his investigative skills proactively to prevent crimes rather than just investigating them after they occurred. The integration of his FBI expertise with his taxi driving duties created a unique form of public service that addressed both transportation needs and victim protection simultaneously. Eddie's work demonstrated that retirement from law enforcement doesn't necessarily mean abandoning the skills, dedication, and protective instincts that define professional investigators. Eddie's interventions have protected not only direct trafficking victims, but entire communities that were being exploited by criminal organizations. His work removed traffickers from neighborhoods, disrupted criminal networks, and made transportation services safer for vulnerable passengers. The training programs Eddie developed have been implemented across the transportation industry, creating systematic approaches to victim identification and assistance that operate 24 hours a day throughout urban areas where trafficking is most prevalent. Eddie's success proved that anti-trafficking efforts depend not just on official law enforcement response, but also on the observational capabilities and protective commitment of experienced professionals working in civilian capacities. Today, Eddie Vasquez continues serving Chicago residents as both taxi driver and anti-trafficking specialist, protecting vulnerable individuals through his daily transportation duties while maintaining vigilance against criminal activities that exploit urban mobility systems. His routes have become some of the safest for potential trafficking victims, not because of increased police presence, but because of the expertise and dedication of a driver who understands that transportation work can serve both mobility and protection purposes. Eddie's mission has expanded beyond trafficking to include identification of domestic violence situations, child abuse cases, and various forms of exploitation that target individuals who use transportation services during vulnerable moments. Eddie's story illustrates how professional expertise developed in federal law enforcement can be repurposed and applied to serve community protection needs while providing meaningful civilian employment for retired investigators. The principle applies beyond trafficking cases. Former law enforcement officers possess skills in pattern recognition, threat assessment, and criminal behavior analysis that can be valuable in numerous civilian contexts where public safety intersects with private services. Eddie's success came from recognizing that his FBI training could serve community needs in ways that traditional employment structures hadn't considered, creating innovative approaches to victim protection and crime prevention. Eddie Vasquez represents thousands of former law enforcement professionals who continue serving their communities after official retirement, using their expertise in creative ways that address ongoing public safety challenges. These individuals create protective networks that operate through ordinary civilian activities, providing assistance and intervention capabilities that residents benefit from without necessarily recognizing the expertise that makes such protection possible. Eddie's taxi became a mobile crisis intervention unit. His driving shifts became anti-trafficking patrols, and his customer interactions became opportunities to identify and assist victims of serious crimes. Where are you watching this story from today? Whether you're in an urban area or a smaller community, consider that the service workers around you might possess expertise that protects vulnerable people in ways you never notice. Behind their professional duties might be training, experience, and dedication that creates safety networks you benefit from without realizing the sophisticated knowledge that makes such protection possible. Eddie Vasquez spent 6 years trying to separate his FBI expertise from his civilian employment, believing that retirement meant leaving criminal investigations behind. But when he recognized that traffickers were using his taxi to exploit victims, he discovered that true service means protecting others regardless of official roles or personal preferences. If you found Eddie's story of protective vigilance compelling, subscribe to Everyday Life Stories for more accounts of the extraordinary expertise hiding behind ordinary job descriptions. Sometimes the most important protection comes from the most unexpected guardians, watching over us during our most vulnerable moments. The real heroes don't always wear badges or work in federal buildings. Sometimes they wear taxi driver uniforms and navigate city streets, protecting victims one ride at a time.